Hello and welcome to Classic Motorsport Podcast. I'm Gareth Thomas, and today, with this episode, we're looking back at possibly the worst motor racing accident of all time, and that is the Le Mans disaster of 1955. Arguably the worst accident and the most deadliest in motor racing history. So, it was during the Le Mans 24 Hours of June 11th and 12th, 1955. The accident took place on June 11th, 1955. The race was the Le Mans 24 Hours on round 4 of the FIA World Sports Car Championship. A total of 87 entries took part, registered for the event. 70 arrived for practice, 60 of them were qualified for the race. 15 of those entries were factory teams. In 1954, the battle between the Coventry-based Jaguars and the Maranello-based Ferraris was joined by Mercedes-Benz from a triumphant return with their 300 SR at the Mia Mia, with dark horses Cunningham, Aston Martin and Maserati with new 3-litre cars, as well as other entries such as Talbot, Gordini, Cooper and Austin Healey. It was anticipated to be a great contest. The reigning winners from last year, Ferrari, arrived with the new 735 LM, quite a brilliant car. Straight six engine derived from the previous year's Formula 1 car and stepped away from the usual 12 cylinders. The Ferrari engine produced 360 horsepower, and they had a mix of young drivers and then F1 drivers. Eugenio Castellati was paired up with Paolo Mazzotto. Maurice Trintignant, who won the 55 Monaco Grand Prix earlier that year, was paired up with Harry Schell. And Umberto Marioli drove with Phil Hill. Mario and Hill had been Ferrari rivals in the previous Carrera Pan America in 1954. Two French private entries also entered Ferraris, but they were 750 Monzas. Those were good cars. Having conquered Formula 1 in 1954, Mercedes-Benz returned to sports car racing, entering 300 SLRs. Many experts rated it as the best sports car in the world. They had fuel-injected 3-litre straight 8s as the most advanced of the entire field, 300 horsepower, 60 down on the Ferraris. They had injuring drum brakes, however, because it was a heaviest, but questionably accurate for the heaviest chassis, facing the tough braking demands of Le Mans. So to compensate that, the 300 SLR had a handbrake and operated air brake that was added to the rear deck lid for high-speed braking. Team manager Alfred Neuber, in a diplomatic move, assembled a multi-nation team for the race, recalling that the war had only ended 10 years earlier. He paired his two best drivers, Argentine's Juan Manuel Fangio and England's Stowe Moss, in the lead car. At the time, Fangio was dominating Formula 1 and Moss was becoming the man he would later become. Carl Kling, who won Le Mans in 1952, was paired with André Simon. Both also drove the F1 team at the time, because at the time you can enter as many cars as you can for F1, where now you've got two cars. John Fitch, an American, was paired up with the elder statesman of French motor racing, Pierre Levegh, in the third Mercedes. Paul Frere, a Belgian racing driver and journalist, had been approached, but he later turned down the offer. Jaguar had 3 works steed types. The model for 1955 had 270 horsepower with a top speed of almost 170 miles an hour. so 30 horsepower less than the Mercedes and almost 100 down on Ferrari. They had the 1953 winners of Tony Watt and Duncan Hamilton, who won infamously driving while under the influence of alcohol. They also had the Mike Hawthorne, who they stole from Ferrari, paired up with Ivor Bueb in the second car, and their third car had Don Bierman sharing the car with Jaguar test driver Norman Duras. There was other D-types entered by Belgium's Écurie Francorchamps and American Briggs Cunningham's team. And about Cunningham, along with the Jaguar that he entered, he also loaned 750 Monzas to French privateer entrant Michel Parzil, racing as Mike Spartan. Spartan would share the car with Marston Gregory. Cunningham entered a brand new Cunningham C6R. He decided to use an Offener 3 litre straight 4. Cunningham would share the car with Sherwood Johnson. The C6R was a brilliant car, as were the D-types. Maserati did make the race in 54 with a pair of elegant 3 litre 300S's. Those cars were brilliant, having already showed promise at Sebring, the 12-hour race done earlier that year. They were won by the team's regular F1 drivers, one shared by Roberto Miras and Sado Pediza, the other by Luigi Musso and endurance race veteran Luigi Veracino. Maserati entered the smaller A6 GCSs in the S200 class. Louis Rosier's private Tolbo did not make the start, although a Gordini with a 3 litre T24S was driven by F1 drivers Jean Bear and Ile Bayol. Like Maserati, they also entered a smaller T20 in the S2000 class. It was great interest for British fans, aside from the Jaguar team. 27 British cars started, nearly half the field. Aston Martin pared back its efforts a bit to just 3 DBSs, now with disc brakes and 225 horsepower on the engines, which is over 135 down on the Ferraris. They had a good driver lineup. Their first car was entered by Peter Grimes and Paul Fryer. The second car had Roy Salvadori paired up with the 1951 winner Peter Walker, and their third car was Tony Brooks and John Wesley Pichard. They persisted with the Legrand project. The 4.5 litre V12 was the biggest engine in the field, and they chose Dennis Poor and Roger Parnell. Loads of cars entered. Triumph, Fraser Nash, Lotus entered with Colin Chapman and Ron Flockhart, Cooper, Oscar, lots of cars. There's 3 categories, the S3000 to the S5000. That was for teams such as Mercedes, Aston Martin, Maserati, Cunningham, Ferrari, Jaguar that I mentioned earlier. S2000 to S1500. That was basically teams such as Gordini and so forth. And then there's the third category, S100 to the S750. During practice, flyers showed themselves to be extremely fast on a single lap, and Castellati set the fastest time for the pole position, a second quicker than Fangio's Mercedes, but there was a number of serious accidents during practice. Sterling Moss was leaving his pits when the DB Panhard of Claude Stores came in. The small car hit Jean Bear. While both cars were able to start the race, Bear had face and leg injuries that would force him out of the event. Bear would later return to racing, only to lose his life at Avis in 1959. A story for another time. Because of Bear's leg and face injuries, he was replaced by the team's reserve driver, Robert Mazon. Another accident was coming to Maison Blanche. Bear's co-driver, Ile Bayol, in the Gordini, came upon 2 spectators crossing the track. He swerved and rolled the car and was taken to hospital with a fractured skull and broken vertebrae. Bale would survive. He would race again, but he walked away from racing as a result. Peter Taylor was severely injured when he crashed into Arnold. Although Taylor did survive, he later recovered. Pierre Levegh had a close brush with a Gordini commenting, "We need to get some sort of signal system working. Our cars are going too fast." Nubar tried and successfully persuaded the ACO to allow him to erect a small signalling tower on top of the pit line for his team. And their cars at the time going as fast as 170 miles an hour on the Mulsanne Straight. At the time, no chicanes. 4 minutes 14 for Castellotti on the pole. Fangio was a second down. The Ferrari of Marioli and Hill was 7 seconds slower. On the flying kilometre on the Mulsanne Straight, 291.2 kilometres an hour for the Ferrari, and it was over 20 kilometres an hour quicker than the Mercedes, 10 kilometres an hour faster than Jaguar, and the Cunninghams could only do 237 miles an hour. Sorry about that. Just cough. For 1955 Le Mans, the only race starter was Count Ame Maggi, the president and the organiser of the Mia Mia, which is a 1,000-mile race. Giovanni Moretti's two cars arrived at grid 2 minutes after the 2 p.m. deadline and were excluded as a result. When the flag came down at 4 o'clock, which was the race start, Castellotti got into the car and led, followed by Hawthorne's Jaguar. Fangio ran to the car, but was delayed. His trouser leg snagged the gear shift lever because he got his leg in and the sleeve of the leg also went through the gear stick, so he had to get his trouser leg out before starting. But he worked his way up the field to join Hawthorne and Castellotti. The crowd's expectations of a showdown between the top 3 marquees were soon fulfilled. By lap 4, the 3 manufacturers' works cars filled the top 8 places, except 29's Ferrari in the pits with an early issue. On the casualties on lap 5 was the leaders lapping the back markers. The tiny Nardi was literally blown off the course into a ditch by the slipstream of the bigger cars. The pace was furious, but Castellotti managed to keep Hawthorne and Fangio at bay for the first hour. Behind them, Marioli's Ferrari, the Cunningham entered Jaguar, and other pairs of works Mercedes-Benz and Jaguars, and in 10th was Mia's Maserati. After 70 minutes, Castellotti mistakenly braked for the Mulsanne corner, but mistaked his braking. That let both Hawthorne and Fangio through. Those two were set about pushing harder still, dropping the Ferrari and successfully beating the lap record, broken 10 times in the first 2 hours. Finally claimed by Hawthorne on lap 28, setting it over 7 seconds faster than the Ferrari's practice lap. Then, at 6:20 p.m, which was lap 35, disaster struck. Hawthorne and Fangio were still racing as hard as ever. In Hawthorne's biography, he said that he was memorised by the legend of the Mercedes superiority. Then as he came to his senses, he thought, damn it, why should a German car beat a British car? The lap before, Hawthorne's pit crew signalled him to come to the pits the following lap. He had just lapped Pierre Levegh's Mercedes, which was running 6th, after Arnold's corners. It was determined to keep Fangio at bay as long as possible. Coming out of the Maison Blanche portion, he rapidly caught Lance Macklin's Austin Healey 100S, seen him and moved over to the right to let him pass, putting another lap on Macklin coming up on the main straight. Hawthorne then raised his hand to indicate he was pitting and pulled across to the right, which caught Macklin unawares. Hawthorne was using this brakes and slowed the Jaguar. there was the main problem about the circuit at the time. There was no designated deceleration lane for the cars coming into the pits. Macklin braked hard while Hawthorne started braking, went off to the white edge of the track throwing up dust. Macklin tried to avoid Hawthorne, whether it was in a selective swerve from surprise or lost control, going to change on road surface. Macklin's car veered across the centre of the track, apparently briefly out of control. This put him into the path of Levegh's Mercedes at 120 miles an hour. Intent of doing another lap in front of Fangio, who was patiently waiting to pass, Levegh had no time to evade, and possibly his last action was raised his hand, warning Fangio an accident was going to occur. That signal would have probably saved Fangio's life. With his eyes shut, Fangio, with his own quick reflexes, screamed through the carnage, just brushing Hawthorne's Jaguar in the pits, but getting through unscathed. Levegh's white front wheel wheeled up the left rear corner of Macklin's car, which acted as ramp, and launched Levegh's car into the air, flying over spectators one end over end for 80 metres. 60 foot. Levegh was thrown free of the tumbling car, but his skull was fatally crushed when he hit the ground. The critical kink in the road put the car on a direct trajectory towards the packed terraces and grandstands. The car landed on an aft embankment between the spectators on the track, bounced and slammed into a concrete stairwell, structured and disintegrated. The moment of the heaviest components of the car, the engine block, radiator and front suspension, hurtled straight into the crowd for almost 100 metres, crushing all in the path. The bonnet lid scattered through the air, sadly causing harm and death to the spectators. Spectators who had climbed onto ladders and scaffolding found themselves in the path of the lethal debris. Jaguar driver Duncan Hamilton watched from the pit wall, and this is what he said. The scene on the other side on the road was indescribable. The dead and the dying were everywhere. The cries of the pain, anguish and despair screamed catastrophe. I stood if I was too afraid to even think. While the rest of Levegh's car landed on the embankment, the rear-mounted fuel tank exploded. Fuel fire raised temperatures of the remaining Econ bodywork, which was lower than other metal alloys due to high magnesium content. Yet, the 300 SLR was built out of magnesium. As a result, a police officer tried to use water, but because of magnesium, it just wouldn't go out until it burned itself out. Macklin's car was heavily damaged. Missing Carl King's Mercedes, Roberto Mears' Maserati and Don Buman's Jaguar, all of which were in the pits refueling. Macklin hit the unprotected pit wall just short of the Cunningham and Mercedes-Benz pits where Shell fuel and Lockheed equipment was stationed. Running down, a policeman, a photographer and two officials all were injured, but the policeman, the photographer and two officials would later make the recovery. But Macklin's car went back to the other end of the track. Macklin survived the incident without serious injury, jumping out the wreck and over the bank. About the accident, Levegh was killed instantly. 83 spectators sadly lost their lives, 120 were injured. Following the accident, Hawthorne overshot his pits and stopped. Getting out, he was immediately ordered by his team to get back and doing another lap, to get away from the total confusion and danger. When he pit stopped the next lap, he staggered out of the car, completely distraught, adamant that he caused the accident. Either Bueb and Norman Duos, both of them on debutants, had to step into their respective cars for their driver's stints. Bueb was very reluctant, but given Hawthorne's condition had no choice, as Duos firmly pointed out to him. John Finch, Levegh's co-driver, had suited up and was ready to take over the car at the upcoming pit stop, and was standing with Levegh's wife Denise Buell. They saw the whole catastrophe unfold. Levegh's lifeless body, severe burnt, lay in full view of the parliament under a garment hold down a banner to cover it. Levegh's wife was so inconsolable and Fitch stayed there until she could be comforted. Half an hour after the crash, Fitch realised that the news was probably going to be broadcast on the radio and had to telephone his family in America to reassure them that he was okay and that Pierre was not. When he got to the media centre to use the telephone, he got fixing into the sheer enormity of the disaster, over hearing a reporter firing that at the time 48 were dead. Later that number would become 83 plus survey, which make it 84. When Fitch returned to the pits, he urged the Mercedes team, at the time managed by Alfred Neuber, to withdraw from the race, as continuing to compete would be a public relations disaster for Mercedes-Benz, regardless whether or not they won or lost. Alfred Neuber, team manager of Mercedes, had already reached the same conclusion, but did not have the authority to make such a decision because, at the time, the decisions had to be made by Mercedes team in Stuttgart. Despite expectations to race to be red flagged, race officials led by race director Charles Foy kept the race running. In the days after the disaster, several explanations were offered for the course of action. And one of the reasons was that if the huge crowd of spectators had tried to leave, they would have choked the main roads around, severely impeding access for medical and emergency crews trying to save the injured and removing the dead. That firms participating in the race could have sued the race organisers for a huge sum of money. That the rough law of sport dictates the race shall go on, though specifically pointing to the 1952 Farnborough Air Show crash as resistance for doing so. Obviously the Farnborough Air Show crash was an airplane crash where some people died, and a final point for the race to continue, that he did not have the authority to stop race at all, and that Prefect Pierre Levegh was the only individual empowered to do so, as France on-site representative to the Ministry of the Interior. Neuber of Mercedes telephoned Mercedes-Benz company directors in Stuttgart, and there was a meeting and a vote of the company directors approving for the team to withdraw from the race. Got the call just before midnight. He decided to wait until 1:45 a.m. where many spectators had left. He stepped onto the track and quietly called his two cars into the pits. At the time, Fangio and Moss were leading, Kling and Simon were third. The results were briefly announced over a public address system. The Mercedes trucks were packed up and gone by the morning. Chief engineer at Mercedes, Rudolf Uhlenreich, had gone to the Jaguar pit to ask if the Jaguar team would respond out of respect to the crash victims. Lofty England, team manager for Jaguar, declined. Hawthorne, Grab and the Jaguar team kept racing, with Mercedes withdrawn and Ferraris out of commission. They had a 5-lap lead from Aston Martin in second place, which was Peter Collins and Paul Frere. The weather closed in on Sunday morning and there was no victory celebration. However, a press photographer showed Hawthorne smiling on the podium drinking from the victor's brown champagne. French magazine Auto Journal posted a sarcastic caption: "A Voltaire Sutter, Monsieur Hawthorne. In English, to your health. Cheers, Mr. Hawthorne." That's what the French spoke after the race. Accounts put the death toll at 80 to 84, either by flying debris or from the fire, with 120 to 178 injured. Observers estimate the toll to be much higher. A special mass was held in the morning for the first funeral victims at the Moore Cathedral. close to the circuit. Ban on motorsports happened temporarily in France, Spain and West Germany. Switzerland banned it. The AAA in America dissolved and handed over their Indianapolis racing to USAC. Most countries lifted their ban within a year of the disaster. France in particular, as a host of Le Mans, lifted their ban on 14th of September. And on that date, the Ministry of the Interior released new regulations about motorsport events. Although France, Spain and Germany decided to go motor racing again, Switzerland banned it. In 2003, Federal Assembly of Switzerland started discussions about the ban should be lifted. It was not. 2015, it was relaxed for electric vehicles only, such as cars involving in Formula E. After Le Mans, they were scheduled to go to the Nürburgring. That was cancelled, as was the non-championship Grand Pan America. 2 rounds were left, Targa Florio and the RICTT. The TT was up next, and then the Targa Florio. And it was run until September and October. Mercedes won both the events and able to secure the Constructors' Championship. After that, Mercedes withdrew from all motorsport and withdrew from Le Mans to 1987. The horror of the crash caused drivers then to, including John Fitch, who retired after the season with Mercedes, Phil Walters, who had been offered a drive with Ferrari for the rest of the season, Sherwood Jones, who retired from racing completely, as did Macklin, after he was involved in a crash that involved the death of another driver at the RACTT. Fangio never raced at Le Mans again. At the Circuit de South at Le Mans, the grandstands and the pits were demolished. Much recrimination was directed at Hawthorne, saying that he cut in front of Macklin and stood on the brakes near the pit entrance, forcing Macklin to take desperate action into the path of Levegh. This is semi-official from the Mercedes team and Macklin's story. Jaguar team put in question the fitness and competence of Macklin and Levegh as drivers. Because of the violent fire and they had used water-based extinguisher on the flame, there were suggestions that Mercedes had tampered with the fuel supply, but that was denied. And obviously fuel tests confirmed that it was the fuel that they had used, and thus that it was dismissed. Opinions differ, and years later Finch claimed, based on his own recollection from what he heard from others, that Hawthorne had caused it. Jurors ventured to opine that Macklin's move on Hawthorne was careless, and Levegh was not competent to meet the demands of driving the speeds of the 300 SLR was capable of. Jaguar and Mercedes issued statements self-defense of their companies, and Macklin, on reading Hawthorne's biography, challenged me to race and was fuming that Hawthorne refused all responsibility for the crash without identifying his cause it. Macklin presumed that Hawthorne was capable, that he was responsible, and began libel action. It was unresolved because Hawthorne lost his life on the Guildford bypass in January 1959, while overtaking a Mercedes-Benz in his Jaguar. Government inquiry into the accident was called. Officials, drivers, team personnel were questioned and gave evidence. In the end, no driver was responsible, and it was a terrible racing accident. The death of spectators were blamed on inadequate safety standards on the track. Lots of drivers, including the likes of Tony Walt, had been raising concerns about the pitch rate since 1953. Over the following 12 months, the ACO, Automobile Club del West, set about making track improvements, widening the track and reducing to 52 starters around the previous 60 and making improvements. But it wasn't until F1 showed their campaign for safety that they showed much better safety improvements, especially when Le Mans hosted the 67 French Grand Prix, where they had to take safety seriously. Although they took safety seriously in 55, they had to took it seriously when they held F1. John Fitch became a major safety advocate, developing safety road cars and race cars with air-filled Fitch barrels. So this was a story. I'm sorry, it's just this story tripped me up a bit. This is a story of how a race that was supposed to be one of the best turned into one of the most deadliest disasters in world motorsport. The Le Mans disaster at the 1955 Le Mans 24 Hours. I'm Gareth Thomas, and this was Classic Motorsport Podcasts. I hope you listen to the story of what went wrong and all that. But remember, like, share, subscribe for more stories of classic motor racing. Goodbye.